Hi everybody, and welcome to our first video of Algebra 1. In this video, our goal is simply to learn some vocabulary terms that we're going to be using in class, so that when we use them in class, you're familiar with them. So the first term that we're going to learn is expression. And expression is a mathematical statement that does not have an equal sign. An example of an expression would be 3x plus 4. So if I was to label this entire thing would be called an expression. Now, within an expression, there's parts of an expression. So a term is the part of an expression that is separated by a plus sign or minus sign. If I were to say, what in this expression would the terms be? 3x would be a term in this expression, and positive 4 would be a different term in this expression. If I were to list them, I would write 3x and then comma, because I'm making a list, and then 4. I don't usually write the plus if it's a positive number. The plus is kind of implied if it's not there. Now, a variable is any letter that could be used to represent any number we want. So an example would be, in this expression, the variable would be x. If I were to say, let's list that as my answer would just be x. Coefficient would be a number that is being multiplied by a variable. So in this problem, there are two different numbers, 3 and 4. But the only one of these numbers that's being multiplied by a variable is the 3. So we would say that that is the coefficient of the variable x. So we would say that 3 is the coefficient in this problem. And finally, a constant is a number that is not being multiplied by a variable. So in this problem, there are two different numbers, the 3 and the 4. Since the 4 does not have a variable, we would say that that is a constant in this problem. So if I was going to list that, I would say that the 4 is the constant. So how exactly are we going to be asking you to identify these? Well, one of the things we might do is give you an expression like this one and ask you to identify the pieces of that expression that we just talked about. So the first thing we might ask you to identify are the terms. Now, in this problem, there are lots of terms, so I'm just going to make a big long list. 3x is a term. Negative 4y is another term. 2 is a term. Negative 7z is a term here. And 8 is a term. I might also ask you to identify the variables. So the variables here would be x, which is a letter that stands for any number we want. Y and z are variables in this problem. I might ask you to identify the coefficients. So the coefficients are numbers that are attached to variables. In this case, the 3 is attached to the x. It's the coefficient of the x. The negative 4 is the coefficient of the y. And the negative 7 is the coefficient of the z. I would not include the 2 or the 8 on this list because those do not have variables. Now, constants are terms or numbers that do not have variables. So this is where I would list the 2 and the 8 because those are both numbers that do not have variables. Finally, we're going to talk about evaluating an expression. When we evaluate an expression, we substitute a number for the variable, and then simplify the expression. So for example, these directions say evaluate 3x plus 4 when x is 2. So what I would do here is I would copy this expression. So I would copy the 3, and then instead of the x, I would replace that with a 2. And then I would copy the plus 4. So all I did was take this 2 and plug it in instead of the x. Now on my calculator, I would type in 3 parentheses 2 plus 4, and I would get 10. So my final answer here would be 10 because that's what I got when I substituted and then simplified. Finally, let's try a few more substituting and then simplifying problems. So I'm going to take this negative 3 and I'm going to plug it in and then simplify because the directions here are telling me to evaluate. So I would have negative 5 minus 2, and then instead of the x, I would put in a negative 3. Now, negative 5 minus 2 parentheses negative 3 would give me 1. So by simplifying this, I would get the number 1. Last but not least, I would substitute, so plug in the negative 5, which means I would have 4 plus, and then instead of x, I would put negative 5. It's very important that when we're substituting, we're using parentheses here, and then squared. So now I would type that in, 4 plus parentheses negative 5 squared, and that would give me 29 as my simplified answer. All right, that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching our first video of Algebra 1. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you tomorrow.